The United Nations has its European headquarters in Geneva. In that very palace, built in the 1920s and 30s as a home for the League of Nations. For 10 years after the First World War, Geneva had been a beacon and a sign for the peacemakers. In 1930, the flame was seen to be flickering, but it was still fueled by the hopes of millions. Geneva's lake seemed no less cheerful to the delegates of 1930, nor were the breezes less bracing. But Wall Street had crashed, world trade was down, men were jobless and hungry in the midst of plenty. It was against this dark sky that the walls of the Peace Palace rose. In every capital, the mood was one of suspicion and distrust. New forms of political extremism were loose and at work. The new hall was not yet ready, so the delegates met downtown. "50 nations joining together to keep the peace and advance the good." Yet the clouds of war were plain to far-seeing men. And among these, a passionate defender of peace was Aristide Briand of France.
Il leur suffira de dire solennellement et fortement, plus de guerre. Nous n'acceptons pas que dans aucun cas, pour aucune cause, dans aucune circonstance, la guerre que nous avons clouée au pilori comme un crime puisse se réveiller contre les peuples.
Briand knew that peace rested on agreement between France and Germany, and he campaigned vigorously for this cause. Among those who cheered him that day were two men from Britain, Lord Robert Cecil and Phillip Noel-Baker. 40 years later, at home in London, those memories were still vivid to Phillip Noel-Baker.
The assembly had become an instrument of tremendous power by 1930-31, because most prime ministers, well, not most, but a large number of prime ministers and a great number of foreign ministers always came to the assembly, and the foreign ministers stayed from the first day to the last. It was a body of very high authority indeed. When I look at the Security Council now, when I think back from that to the days when Arthur Henderson and Stresemann and Briand and Austin Chamberlain and Lord Balfour and other people of that caliber went to sit in the Council of the League, gave it a world prestige which made it impossible for governments to reject its findings. I'm afraid I think we've gone downhill in that regard a very great deal.
In the first decade of its existence, the Council of the League had acquired a bedrock authority. Its decisions might sometimes be criticized or condemned, but nobody ignored or flaunted the Council itself. It was the peacekeeping body of the League, that part of the machine which acted quickly when there was danger in the Baltic or the Mediterranean or the Yellow Sea. In 1925, it brought a full stop to what had appeared to be inevitable war between Greece and Bulgaria. At such times, Geneva was the hub of the world, its stars a who's who of the diplomacy of the age. Benish came for Czechoslovakia, and Briand appeared with Julius Curtius, the German foreign minister. The world of diplomacy, formerly closed and obscure, had opened up at last, even to the newsreel cameras.
Journalists talking with Monsieur Laval, the French Prime Minister. The informal manner in which the press obtains its information in Geneva marks a new departure in international practice. Here is the press room, where sometimes as many as 400 journalists compose their messages, which are then dispatched by a special telegraph and telephone office all over the world. From this room, it is possible to speak with countries as far away as America, India, and China. The bar, where journalists refresh themselves in the intervals of obtaining copy. It is naturally here that most of the comments are made.
The staff of the League, now 600 strong, kept things running and collected the facts and figures for all.
That you, Samson? I wonder if you can tell me the meaning of an obscure Finnish word I've got here. I think it's perhaps something to do with fishing tackle.
The League was on the air with shortwave transmitters to carry its programs to far continents. It printed pamphlets on child welfare, the opium trade, the armament statistics of the world. While over all this activity there presided the genial figure of Sir Eric Drummond, the League's first Secretary General. Alongside the League, but independent of it, was the International Labor Organization, a forum for workers, employers, and governments, all pledged to improve conditions of labor. In The Hague, the newly established World Court was in session. Also independent of the League, but with judges elected by the League, the court gave judgments on legal disputes among the nations.
And by the time that the League began to break up, the court had dealt with 30 or 40 cases, some of them advisory opinions, but almost equally as binding as the verdicts. The Council of the League had dealt with scores of disputes, some of them very important between great powers. They had not only settled the disputes and secured a peaceful agreement in every case, they had stopped 4 wars within a week. They had shown that the covenant was the living law by which the nations wanted to conduct their affairs. And attempt after attempt had been made to prepare the disarmament which would get rid of the militarist forces that make for war and which would leave the League free to operate in a world of law. And then there came the Disarmament Conference.
In high optimism, the spokesmen of the military powers assembled in Geneva in February of 1932. Some were non-members of the League, like the United States, one of whose delegates was Mary Woolley.
May this conference mean a long step forward toward friendliness and goodwill among the nations and races of this world.
Britain's Arthur Henderson, president of the Disarmament Conference, warned what might happen if it failed.
The world would again be in danger of rapidly expanding armaments. Are we ready to face our task?
I may venture to make concrete suggestions. The Japanese delegation are in favor of reduction in the size of battleships and in the caliber of their guns.
Dans les domaines navals, 1. Abolition simultanée des bâtiments des lignes et des sous-marins. 2. Abolition des navires porte-avions.
Mussolini's foreign minister, Grandi, had taken a very strong line in favor of proposals for drastic all-round disarmament which were put forward by President Hoover on behalf of the United States. Those proposals were accepted unexpectedly by Russia as being an adequate first step. They were accepted unexpectedly by Germany as being an adequate first step. Japan was against, but only mildly, in the sense that the Japanese militarist opposition could have been overcome. Britain and France hesitated. They hesitated too long. After Hitler had come into power, Eden put up a draft treaty, rather Ramsay MacDougall put it up, but Eden and Alec Cadogan and General Temperley had prepared it on our behalf. They put up a draft disarmament treaty, which could quite easily have succeeded if it had been put forward 6 months sooner.
Well, I think you could say that in theory it was as near as that. I mean, we did come quite close, and I think that the convention that Ramsay MacDougall presented at the end, with all the figures in it, could conceivably, on paper at least, have achieved what it sought. But of course, behind it all was the arrival of Hitler. And I don't think that once that had happened, and all the things that Hitler stood for and that he was determined to do, I doubt whether anything we could have reached agreement upon, if we could have, would have stood for very long, because he would have found some pretext to see that it didn't.
The Disarmament Conference failed, synchronously with Hitler's rise to power. He denounced the Versailles Treaty, quit the League, and started massive rearmament. Yet the first direct threat came not from Germany, but Japan. The priests bless an army leaving to conquer Manchuria, China's northernmost province. Japan's forces seized this territory in 1931, creating there the so-called State of Manchukuo. The road to World War II was open, and the first refugees in a column that was to be 40 years long trundled past the cameras. Faced with this first act of open defiance, the League met quickly to consider the seizure of Manchuria. But no government was anxious to be the first to confront the aggressor. The Assembly sent out an investigating commission to see and to report under the chairmanship of a British diplomat, Lord Lytton.
On the other side, on the left, the second building from the third building from auditorium is the library.
By the time Lytton came back to Geneva with his report, 13 months had passed since the Japanese invasion.
We found that the Japanese occupation of this large part of China was not justified on the ground of self-defense, and that the new state which had been set up was a Japanese protectorate rather than a genuine case of Manchurian self-determination.
Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
Japan's delegates knew well that there was no real power behind the League's condemnation. They packed their briefcases, smiled, and walked out of the League. But by now, the USSR was alarmed at developments in Asia and Europe and asked to join the League. The Soviet delegate was Maxim Litvinov.
Je suis convaincu que si l'on en a la volonté ferme, et si tous les membres sont désirés de collaborer étroitement, on peut faire beaucoup de choses
pour réduire au minimum les dangers de guerre.
With the Soviet Union as a new member, the Council took up the destiny of a pocket of land between France and Germany, where an international military force was dispatched to ensure order in a plebiscite. The Saarlanders were overwhelmingly German-speaking, and they voted to join Germany rather than France. Yet the plebiscite was run fairly, and the anti-Nazis were able to leave safely. But now a graver threat was looming from the south.
Soffocare la vita del popolo italiano in quel mare che fu il mare di Roma, ebbene si sappia che il popolo italiano salterebbe con un solo uomo in piedi.
In Africa, Mussolini's armor was poised on the frontiers of Ethiopia, his soldiers sworn to wipe out the humiliation of Adowa, where Ethiopian tribesmen had defeated Italy in 1896. Haile Selassie mobilized his troops, armed mostly with ancient rifles. At Geneva, the gathering Ethiopian crisis dominated these weeks. The Council met repeatedly, and among its members was a young British minister who had been sent to Rome to try to ward off the Italian invasion, Anthony Eden, later Lord Avon.
Mussolini, in my experience, alone, was a perfectly reasonable person to talk with. The histrionics were all kept for when there were more than one or two gathered together. At least that was my experience. We had an extremely difficult meeting. I completely failed to make any impression. Looking back on it now, I think he'd made up his mind long before ever I arrived in Rome. I remember one thing in particular which struck me, which may interest you. He turned to me one time and he said, now, Adowa, look at Adowa. We have to avenge Adowa. And it struck me such an extraordinary point of view. But I said, what would happen to us, the British, if we had to do that? We've had so many defeats, I don't know where we'd begin. Would we have to avenge Bunker's Hill? And if so, where would that lead us? And for a moment he smiled, but only for a moment. And there's no doubt it had eaten into him that Italy had got to win back this lost reputation, as he thought it was, over Adowa.
October 1935. Italy strikes at Ethiopia. The League brands Italy an aggressor, but can do little to help the retreating Ethiopians. The Council calls for economic sanctions, tries to twist Mussolini's arm with a trade embargo, but the Italian army rolls on.
Le gouvernement éthiopien a le devoir de proclamer, en toute loyauté, que, subissant une guerre injuste, décidé à défendre jusqu'à la mort son indépendance et son intégrité, quelque longue que doit être cette guerre, il ne cédera pas la faute.
Monsieur le délégué, on ne supprime pas la guerre, on la remplace. Et on la remplace parce que l'histoire ne s'arrête pas. Si pour son compte, la Société des Nations s'arrête, l'histoire qu'on ne peut pas forcer par des sanctions poursuivra son chemin, car son chemin est la vie.
The League has two main tasks. First, to avert war by the just and peaceful settlement of all disputes. Secondly, if we fail in our first objective, to stop war. And it is by the League's effectiveness in realizing this aim that the League will be judged.
Sanctions did not keep the Italian bombers from taking off. Mussolini's son told reporters how agreeable it was to bomb the tribesmen. After 7 months of fighting, the Italian army marched into Addis Ababa, and the Negus fled his country. To Geneva on the 30th of June, 1936, came the man without a country. The League's delegates had failed him, though they were still prepared to listen to his words. But high up in the press gallery, a group of Italian propagandists had other plans.
Dès les premiers mots du négus, des journalistes italiens l'interrompent par des coups de sifflet auxquels répondent de nombreux applaudissements. Le service d'ordre intervient et les manifestants sont expulsés.
Je prie l'Assemblée de m'excuser si je ne m'exprime pas en français. Je dirai toute ma pensée avec toute la force de mon esprit et de mon cœur en parlant en amharique. ጦርነቱ እንደተጀመረ በ1935 ዓመተ ምህረት መጨረሻ የኢጣሊያን የአውሮፕላኖች በጦር ሰራዊት ላይ የጋዝ ላክሬሞጅን ያለበት ቦምብ ጣሉባቸው።
Within a month, civil war flared up in Spain. Soon Hitler was to snuff out Austria and Czechoslovakia after that. But with the going of Selassie, the League ended its life as a peacekeeping body. Collective security was dead. The teeth of aggression were bared, and the sword was out of the scabbard. Almost as though it were moved by a sense of guilt, the League turned its primal energies to the humanitarian field. Thwarted as a guardian of the peace, it nevertheless found other work to do, putting down the slave trade in Liberia, setting optimum housing standards for every region, tightening controls on narcotic drugs and persuading governments to exchange information on violators, laying the groundwork for a World Bank, launching a campaign against malaria, 250 million cases a year, collecting up the best brains to write a milestone report on the relationship between good food and good health. The new Secretary General, Joseph Avon of France, pressed on with this work until the war put a fascist ring around Switzerland and cut off Geneva from the rest of the world. Those were 5 dark years, when the light of Geneva faded to a memory. It was far away in San Francisco that the new torch was to be lighted. In 1946, the last assembly of the League of Nations convened in Geneva to hand over its assets and responsibilities to the newborn United Nations. Presiding then was Carl Hambro of Norway.
I now declare the last meeting of the 21st and last Assembly of the League of Nations closed.
The meeting is called to order. Ladies and gentlemen,
it is a generation later. In New York, the president of the General Assembly is now the son of Carl Hambro, the man whose gavel brought the League to an end. Today, Edvard Hambro is in the chair at a meeting of Nobel Prize winners, and one of them is a man whose eyes had seen it all, the entire life cycle of the League and the first quarter century of the United Nations, Phillip Noel-Baker.
Those who said more armaments would make their nations safe only led their nations to disasters never dreamed of in human history before. Aggressive wars in Manchuria, in the Chaco, in Abyssinia, in Spain, the League's collapse, Munich, the Second War. The Second War, with 17 million soldiers killed in battle, 6 million Jews gassed to death, 6 million Poles massacred by firing squads, more than 50 million human beings who lost their lives. The burning of Hamburg, of Dresden, of Tokyo, scores of thousands of little children who ran around like human torches in those hellish conflagrations till they died. The oldest fallacy in any language: if you want peace, prepare for war. How much more so those who today put their faith in nuclear bombs. The truth is that the armaments themselves now create the danger against which they are supposed to guard.
The search for a way to control those arms and those emotions still goes on. The nations still send their delegates to New York and also to Geneva to work for peace. Some say there are better ways to tame the beast within us. Some have visions and dreams of a peaceful planet in a golden age. But those who must work for peace with their eyes open know that this is as close as we have come.